So I want to talk about the very important issue of labour rights, workers' rights, employee rights, whatever way you want to describe it. But in general, the basic rights that workers should have. For me, this is a very, very basic, fundamental human rights issue. I take the view that if someone is being asked to do a certain job, they should be paid for that. If that is the understanding, if it's a non voluntary job, if it's a job that is intended to be paid, they should be paid and they should be working in reasonable conditions. Obviously, there's a huge variety of jobs. Jobs vary greatly, people's skills vary greatly, people's backgrounds varies greatly. So different jobs will have different requirements. I mean, working in a call center obviously isn't going to have the same criteria as being a soldier or a police officer. So jobs vary. But as a general principle, I am a strong believer in employee rights. This partly comes from personal experience, but it also comes from just a genuine, general sense of what is right, what is fair. So just talk briefly about the personal experience, get that out of the way, because I don't want people to think that's the main guiding principle of this video. It's not, but it is part of it. And certainly it has helped to shape my views. I've been a waiter on 3 occasions now. Waitering is one of those sort of jobs that is very often the butt of jokes, or it's seen as a job that no one really wants, but someone has to do it. Well, I've done it 3 times. It's been quite a long time now, but overwhelmingly, I found it to be a negative experience. And on one of those occasions, I felt basically like I was screwed over by the guy I was working for. What actually happened was he called me in for the interview. He wasn't there in person. Okay, I appreciate a manager might be busy. So someone else interviewed me and they asked if I had previous experience. I did. Um, they showed me the basic rundown. It was quite a big restaurant. It was a buffet restaurant. And that was it. Basically, I got the job. So initially I was happy about that because I got a job. Now, the big mistake I made in that initial interview was not really clarifying the pay situation. At the time, I was out of work and I was so keen to get work that I was just happy to have got it. I kind of overlooked that point. And that was a mistake on my part because I realised now had I been more assertive, maybe what subsequently happened either wouldn't have happened or I wouldn't have been in that situation. Anyway, I worked there for a week. I was doing nightly shifts, not particularly long shifts, but nevertheless hard work, scraping plates, collecting plates, getting orders. Some of the more experienced staff had a go at me a few times because, I was getting used to the place and I'd made a few mistakes. But anyway, I worked there, done everything I was asked to do, and so on. Not a fun job. I'd done it before, so broadly knew what to expect. Anyway, at the end of the week, I'd done about, I guess, 15 hours or so. I I said to the girl in reception, "Excuse me, if possible, I'd like to speak to the manager or someone in charge. I want to discuss the pay situation." And she basically told me the manager's in London and you don't get paid for the first week. Now, for me, this was bullshit. I quit basically on the spot. Um, And I tried in vain to sort of pursue it. I think I phoned the manager at one point and said, "Look, I work for you. Am I going to be paid?" Um, my logic was I'd worked for the guy, I'd given him my labour, I should be paid. And for me, the issue about not being paid on the first week, about it being a training week, for me, that is something that is essential to tell someone before they do the job. So I think the problem in that place was just they couldn't care less. It was just sort of a slack attitude to employees. Oh, like we'll just use them kind of thing. That's honestly the impression I got. But people might say, "Oh, but that's a procedure. You don't get paid." Fine. You see, the thing is, it isn't even about not being paid that week. It's about the fact that I feel I was misled. That was the issue. If they'd said, okay, you don't get paid for the first week, then I'd know, that's fine. Okay, at least I know. But it was that aspect of not knowing. So as far as I'm concerned, they just got free labour out of me. And I was very angry about it, and it bugged me for quite a long time. And I've had similar experiences. So that has really put things in context as to what goes on out there. It's rife within the catering industry, and I'm not by any means saying that every restaurant is the same. Certainly, there will be managers that are better than others. Um, but I think it is rife in the catering industry. And the problem is, we have this culture whereby it's sort of seen as if you complain about it, then you're just a whinger, or you're not doing your part, or something like that. There's always We have to change this mentality that there's something wrong with the concept of workers' rights. In my opinion, it doesn't make you some sort of red flag carrying communist. It's just about basic fairness. I really think if a boss, if a manager knowingly doesn't pay someone, to me that's no different than a thief stealing your bike, because they're getting something from you and they're not giving something back. I got nothing for that. I'd given the guy 15 hours of my labour, nothing in return. Roughly 15 hours. I can't remember exactly. It was a few years ago now. 15, 20 hours, something like that. So it wasn't a huge amount of time. It could have been worse. It could have been there for weeks on end. But, free labour is free labour. So I felt really upset by that. And when I look at the current situation in this country and around the world, clearly there is a long, long way to go before there is really a strong instillment, if I could put it that way, of fairness. And certainly it is more rife in some jobs than others. Um, a job should be a mutual contract, i.e., the employee should follow a protocol, they should be reliable, they should be hardworking. But in return, they should get fair pay on time and with no bullshit. So for me, this is something that has to be enshrined in law, and not just enshrined in law, acted on as well. You see, in the UK, we do have labour laws. So, for example, we have a legal minimum wage, and we have the possibility of workplace tribunals, for example, if someone is unfairly dismissed. But what we don't have really is any sense that those in a position of power will really face consequences if they screw people over. So, in the catering industry, for example, um, what could I have done in that situation? What resource did I have to go to? That for me is a problem. I'm just using my own case as an example because I'm sure there will be many other people out there who've had similar experiences. Um, there has to be an equilibrium in terms of giving people empowerment. So if someone is, at the moment, for example, we have workplace tribunals if someone is unfairly dismissed. But as far as I know, there's no sort of mechanism in place for helping people if they haven't been paid. Um, and this is why, for me, it is a basic human rights issue. Um, it's just a basic question of fairness. I mean, in my case, I didn't have any dependents, I didn't have any children, I'm not a married man. I can imagine for someone who's struggling to get by with young children, it's a really awful situation because for them, they wouldn't have the choice of quitting, which is what I done. And I've no guilt in doing that because I'm not going to work for someone who treats me that way. But I appreciate there's some people who don't have that choice. So this, for me, has to be instilled. And it's frankly one area that I could never call myself a conservative on because I believe this is something that conservatives, I do believe when it comes to working conditions, they put profit before people. That is my gut instinct with Tory ideology. And it's why I can never bring myself to describe myself as a conservative across the board. Certainly, there's some issues I'd be sympathetic with them on, but I don't believe they have their heart in the right place when it comes to um, workplace rights. Um, that traditionally would be the Labour Party. And I do think certainly Corbyn's Labour is a lot more in check with things like this. And whilst I have many disagreements with Jeremy Corbyn, I do give him credit for raising these sort of issues. Okay, it's socialism, but so be it. So be it. I'm a centrist. That means I will agree with aspects of left and right. And if this is an aspect of socialism, there it is. I agree with it. Um, for me, it's just a basic question of fairness. And I'm just thinking of the UK. I mean, around the world, there's some disgraceful situations in the Gulf states. Um, the way Pakistani laborers are treated by rich Arab sheikhs is frankly disgusting. Um, and they always deny it, but you have situations where people are not paid for months on end and threatened with all sorts of repercussions if they complain. That's appalling. And this is why human rights groups are so important in the work that they do in exposing these things, in putting pressure on governments. It's so important because labor rights, it shouldn't be seen as like, a Marxist thing or workers of the world unite. For me, it's actually not anti business. In fact, for me, being pro business is about a situation where everyone is happy. Now, surely if workers are happy, if employees are happy, that's better for the business. So actually, you can make a capitalist argument in favor of workers' rights. Because if workers are happy, that helps them to be motivated in their work, which means fewer people quitting, which means that you're going to have more profit ultimately anyway. So having good labor rights isn't anti-business. It isn't anti um, profit. It's simply pro fairness. I think this is such a fundamental point, and I cannot understand why anyone, for example, would oppose a minimum wage. That I've seen conservatives trying to make excuses for that, and I just cannot. I cannot fathom how anyone can rationally try to argue that it's fair. Because they're thinking entirely from the business perspective. They're not thinking about the human fairness perspective. In other words, under the logic that there should be no minimum wage, in theory, in theory, a boss could get away with paying 50 pence per hour. Now that's an extreme example, but that's what it basically means. If you don't have a guideline, no, not a guideline, a law for saying if you pay less than this to an employee, you're breaking the law, then there will be plenty of greedy bosses out there who will do that. They will pay people much less than the legal minimum wage. And we do have an issue with migrant workers um, being happy to take a salary because when it works out pro rata to the rate in their country, it is a decent wage. But I personally, it makes me very uncomfortable because I feel if someone does work, they should get paid fairly for it. It's just a basic view that I have, and that shouldn't be such a radical position. Basic position of fairness. So, I cannot understand why anyone would oppose a minimum wage. I can understand why big business people might, because it means they save money. But I see people trying to defend it, and I despair because it just seems odious that you're asking someone to work long hours, you're asking them to basically do everything you say, but you're going to pay them a pittance for it. No, no way. So, in my opinion, there needs to be an enforcement of fair pay. And I believe in some sort of body, some sort of watchdog that keeps a close eye on big companies that they do that. And I honestly believe that companies or managers that don't pay their staff should be treated no better than common criminals. Really. I mean, fundamentally, there is no moral difference between a boss taking free labor from an employee and a thief taking that employee's property. Because when they're giving free labor, they're giving something. They should get something for that. So if a boss doesn't pay them, it's not that different to being robbed, really. Um, I feel very strongly about that. And yeah, my own personal experience certainly guided that, but I think I would feel that way even without that experience, because I do believe it is a human rights issue. Um, my father actually worked in this field, and I don't think he would mind me mentioning this. He was the port chaplain for the port of Rotterdam. It's the world's third busiest seaport, very busy place. And he often dealt with welfare issues where sailors would be on a ship, often from the Philippines, but from other countries as well. And there would be issues about them having an authoritarian captain who wouldn't let them leave the ship, even if it was to get medical supplies, because these people are at sea for long periods of time. Sometimes they may have medical issues, and they need to get supplies in dock in Rotterdam. And I remember my father had to negotiate those situations, and I'm very proud of the work my father done there, because that was a basic human rights issue. The difficulty in seaports is a sovereignty issue because whilst on a ship, it is the sovereignty of wherever the ship is based, as I understand it. So there's a whole issue about negotiating to get onto the ship. Um, and the Dutch authorities, in my father's experience, weren't particularly helpful all the time. So um, this is something that is worldwide. And, I could make a much, much, much longer video about this. There's many issues to cover. And I haven't even touched on slave labor, like forcing children in the Democratic Republic of Congo to get copper and other minerals. That's far worse than anything I've been through. What I went through was unpleasant, but there's people in the world who basically are modern day slaves. That's disgusting. And as far as I'm concerned, anyone keeping another human being in slavery or forced servitude in that way, other than the criminal justice system, should absolutely be treated with total contempt, and there should be severe consequences for that. Um, it sickens me to the core that we're in 2017 and slavery is still an issue. And I know I'm digressing a little bit from the initial point, but fundamentally, everyone has to be respected. And if you are a business person, if you're a manager, then you have every right to expect your employees to be reliable. But by the same token, they have a right to expect that you will treat them fairly. And not paying someone is tantamount to exploitation. That's what it is. And I just think it's an abomination. So yeah, I do have very strong views on this. I am not particularly convinced that the Conservative Party care that much. I haven't seen any um, strong evidence that they really, really have their heart in the right place in terms of acting against these sort of bosses. Of course, they'll say the right things. They'll say we're against exploitation and all the rest of it, but um, I think fundamentally the ideology is that profit is more important than people. And that's an area I just can't align myself with conservative thinking. Um, I have also noticed is very prevalent in North America. There seems to be a real stigma in North America, especially the United States, around the very notion of workers' rights. Like if you talk about it, you're some sort of communist. I can't understand that. Um, I guess it comes from the notion that the land of opportunity is that wealth is good. Well, it is. I can understand that, but it shouldn't be at the price of kicking the little man. Um, there is nothing radical about saying workers should have basic rights, like being paid fairly, on time, and not working in undue dangerous conditions. Or if they have to work in dangerous conditions, give them the protective clothing, etc. So this is why trade unions are necessary. I don't always agree with union decisions. I don't always agree, for example, with wildcat strikes. I certainly don't agree with every strike. It varies depending on the exact circumstances. Um, I don't necessarily agree with some of the transport strikes going on now, but fundamentally, unions developed because they had to develop. Because if they didn't develop, then you would have a situation where those in power would always have this control type situation. Workers would have no rights. So unions sometimes get slack, but they do have a place. And bear in mind, there's parts of the world, ironically, in single party communist states that crack down on unions. That's ironic because often in conservative circles they love to attack unions, but they overlook the fact that it is totalitarian communist states that very often persecute the very same unions. So that's something ironically conservatives and communists have in common, despite communists supposedly being about workers' rights. Anyway, uh, it's quite a long video, but I think these issues are very important. It isn't just about it being in law. In my opinion, there has to be a way to really, really look at this, and there has to be a way that employees have somewhere to turn. People who face situations like I did, if someone isn't paid, they should go to some sort of body to be able to say, look, I've worked for this person, they haven't paid me. Because it's not a police matter. They can't just go to the police and say, oh, they didn't pay me. The police wouldn't do anything about it. Because as far as I know, there's no law. There's no specific law that's um, stipulates against that. So, in my opinion, there needs to be some sort of advisory body or some sort of outreach that workers know about that they can go to, that they can say, look, this person hasn't paid me. Can you do something about it? And then that body can put pressure on the organization and basically get them to cough up. If someone has done work for you, you pay them. I think it's very important.